Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking about a self-sufficient garden. So let's talk a little bit about what is self-sufficiency, because self-sufficiency and self-reliance seem to go hand in hand with homesteading, okay? Being able to rely on yourself, your knowledge, and the resources that you have, rather than those of others, is something that a lot of people are craving. And to me, a self-sufficient garden is really one that produces its own nutrients. So it produces its own fertilizer, its own mulch, and it produces all this without external resources being brought in. So I don't need to keep ordering compost from, the city dump or buy it in from the big box store, for example. And to me, a self-sufficient garden also produces the produce that I need for it to grow to feed me and my family, but it also produces the seeds to grow for the following season. And that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit here, and how I got my garden set up to do that. Now, your garden or homestead really should be able to produce enough compost to feed all of your plants that are there. And you can definitely get a head start on composting. You can be composting your waste from your kitchen. If you don't have a compost pile started, then definitely check out some of the previous episodes that I've done talking about how to compost. You can also check out some of the other resources on the website, and I will put some of those links down at the bottom so you can check out those. But if you've been listening a while, then you'll know that composting, mulch and soil diversity are all things that I talk about, and they're the key to growing an abundant garden. And when it comes to setting up a self-sufficient garden, one of the big things that I spend a lot of time on is planning, okay? There's a good old saying that we were taught as kids, which was prior planning and preparation prevents piss poor performance. And it's true, okay? I'm definitely a planner, and I like to plan things out on paper. So I map all of my garden beds, and, they're just sketched up in a little journal, and I know what's growing in which bed, and I've got kind of rough ideas on what the timings for plants to be done are, but I don't necessarily have those in a map. I actually have those in a giant spreadsheet list that's got all these days to maturity in there, and it kind of plums out when I can be expecting a harvest if the conditions are ideal. But that's how I like to operate. So I spend a lot of time of planning, and you can plan your garden too. You can just sketch out your garden space, or you can do a fancy spreadsheet diagram if that's what's cool for you. But take a tape measure and figure out the size of your garden beds, because you're going to want to know what square footage you have, because that's going to help you figure out how many plants and how many seeds you're going to be able to plant in each bed. Now, I like to plant lots of different things together in a bed to try and make more of those kind of spaces, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Seeds, deciding on your seeds to grow. And honestly, the best advice I can give when it comes to seeds is to grow things that you like to eat, okay? I really love growing squash and beans, okay? My family don't necessarily love the squash and beans, but I'm not about to spend a lot of space and energy growing Brussels sprouts because I don't necessarily like them. I eat a lot more vegetables and prefer a more vegetarian slant on my diet than what my family do, okay? My family like a lot of meat. My husband grew up in Texas. He eats a lot of meat. That's not like how I like to eat. I ate a lot more veggies and things in the UK, and a lot more fish than I do here. So I like to grow more things to have a wider variety of fruit and vegetables in my diet. But I always grow things that we really like to eat. And we've kind of come together at somewhat of an agreement when it comes to squashes. So I like to grow a variety of squashes. There was an interview I did a couple of years ago, and somebody asked me about what sort of plants I love to grow. And one of the differences between growing here and growing in the UK was that there was just so many more varieties of squash that became available to me to be able to grow. And I think when I grow up, like if I could be anything, I think I would probably go into like farming squashes or becoming a seed saver for different squash plants, because I just love all the varieties, the colours, the textures, the shapes, the sizes, everything that's there, and being able to explore those in the kitchen as well as in the garden is always really exciting to me. So, for example, my husband really likes the acorn squashes and the spaghetti squash. I'm not really a fan of the acorn squashes. I much prefer those buttercup type squashes, or the turban type squashes that kind of have the little bump on the bottom of them, because I much prefer those kind of textures when I'm roasting them, whereas things like the acorn squash, it doesn't really have the right texture to me. So as a happy medium, I grow spaghetti squashes every year, and then I will alternate between growing acorn squashes and then the buttercup squashes that I like every other year. So at least we're kind of meeting in the middle somewhat. One of the things I will say about your seed growing is I think it's really important for you as a gardener to try a different variety within your growing season. And I think it's really important to try a different variety of whatever your vegetables are, to see if they're going to produce better for you. So we have lots of tried and true favorites. Okay, I mentioned a couple in the squashes, but I also like to say that we grow a new variety each year to just to try and just see what it does. Okay, so this year, as an example, I've got a couple of rare heirloom varieties that I'm growing. Like, the seeds were very difficult to find and get hold of, so I'm trying some of those, and I got some of those through like the Seed Savers Exchange, which is over on Seed Savers website, and I'll make sure to link up to that. And honestly, some of the seeds that I'm growing, I don't even know what they're going to be looking like or doing, because some of the listings are just kind of numbers and very vague descriptions. And that's kind of the scientist and the explorer in me, is to see what's kind of going to happen with these. But I digress. That's kind of me nerding out about plants. But in general, try to plant new varieties of your favorite plants each season, but also grow a tried and true favorite, or something that you know produces well. Okay, this isn't just me encouraging you to experiment in your garden, although that is part of the fun, and you know, every year and every garden is an experiment. But I encourage you to have these trials, because you might find something that's going to grow much better for your area. It might be better tasting, it might tolerate heat or cold more than your usual variety, or it might resist bugs or diseases that are prevalent where you live. Okay, and you're not going to know unless you try. And if you don't like the variety, then you can always go to a local seed swap and, you know, give those seeds away. And in exchange for something different. I mean, I found even where I work that there are so many gardeners now, and they're all kind of coming out the woodworks, and it's kind of fun, because I love hearing about people's gardens, and I love hearing about what they're growing, and I love seeing all these pictures that people are sharing of their gardens. And you know, we've been swapping seeds across different people, even in the workplace. So there's options for you if you grow something that you don't really like, but you've got this packet of seeds and you don't know what to do with it. You could also consider donating it to a local community garden, because some community gardens have programs for those people who may not be able to afford a plot or afford seeds and things to grow there. So definitely check those things out. But when you're looking through the catalogues or online, definitely pay attention to the growing zones for the plants. Lots of websites allow you to search by your growing zone. Don't try to grow something suited to the subtropics if you are living in Alaska, okay? It's not going to work. It might work if you've got a whole heated greenhouse set up, and you're going to be heating it year round. That might be an option for you, but for most people that are listening to this, it probably isn't. Okay, so make a wise decision when it comes to parting with your hard-earned cash, especially when it comes to seeds. If you've got a short growing season, then look at those quick cropping varieties with shorter days to maturity. They sometimes are also noted as being like cold weather, or short season, or suitable for northern states, okay, are some of the key phrases that they use. And if you're a new gardener, try to keep to 1 to 2 varieties of plants so you don't get overwhelmed, okay? So for example, maybe grow a paste tomato for canning and a fresh eating variety, or maybe some pole beans for drying and some bush beans to eat fresh, okay? Just because I grow 20 different varieties doesn't mean that you have to. I started just like you, growing 1 or 2 varieties, and my skills just developed, okay, over time. And it really is easy to get overwhelmed by planting too much and trying to do it all. And I'll be honest, I've been there, and I've done that. And one of the best pieces of advice I can give is to take small steps so you can own the basics like a boss and build on your experience. And I've kind of felt those feelings of looking over at somebody else's plot and it's doing so much better than mine. Like, I've had one of my co-workers showing me pictures of his garden, and he's got ripe red tomatoes already. His watermelon is like 6 times the size of my watermelon plant. Like, he's been harvesting summer squashes and things for the last couple of weeks, and mine have been eaten by slugs. And it's really easy to get caught up into that view of, I'm not doing a good enough job, my garden's a failure, and kind of those aspects of it. But actually, it's really important for you to take a step back and kind of look at what is working on your garden. And I know we talked a little bit about this in the Homestead Overwhelm episode, but take a look at what is coming out of your garden and what is doing well. And things that aren't doing so great, okay, don't worry about it. Maybe you can barter with that friend that is doing well on those crops. So for example, my garlic this year has done really well, and I'm going to be trading some garlic for some fresh zucchini. Okay, my zucchini's been eaten a bunch of times by slugs and snails. We've had quite a wet June, and now we're going into July. It's kind of getting a bit late for me to be sowing seeds again, and I didn't want to be buying transplants to be putting out into the garden for that. So I'm okay with no summer squash this year, but I got plenty of friends who are going to be needing to give zucchini away, so I'm kind of happy to barter away some of my garlic for some zucchini. So homesteading and growing a garden is kind of fostering some of those, cultures and not necessarily reliances on other people, but fostering those connections and relationships so that, if things aren't growing very well, then, you can step into, a relationship with somebody else who's able to provide something that you are needing. And that's something that I really miss from having a plot on the allotment, because this would happen all the time in the UK. And, my neighbour on the allotment had this massive rhubarb plant, and he would always give me a big heap of the stalks, and he gave me crowns to transplant into my plot. And although we didn't necessarily agree on how we were growing, because he sprayed everything with chemicals and I did everything organic, we didn't see eye to eye for that. But when we had an overabundance of something, we always shared. And that's one of the great things with having a garden, is being able to do that. But even if you're a small time new gardener, starting small, growing those tomatoes for, fresh eating off a sauce, or growing some salads all summer, that's okay. And I want you to focus on those things that are growing well. And, if you do find yourself in a bit of a pickle when it comes to harvest time, although I didn't intend the pun then, but consider inviting friends and relatives to help harvest, cook, or even can stuff, okay? Because you can share the load and the harvest, and you get to spend time with them, okay? So make sure that you invite people over that you really want to spend time with, because that's important, and we do that too here. And that's, I think, one of the big keys to us having such a good garden, is that we're getting our friends and family involved to help with things like the harvesting and stuff like that. I mean, it all works out, and being able to spend time in the garden with people, maybe having a light dinner al fresco or something like that, it makes a big difference. And having somebody else sometimes take a look at what you're trying to do in the garden can really help kind of boost your morale, and help you tackle a problem with a lot more vigor than what you were doing before. And when it comes to planning the garden too, I make sure to involve the family in the plan for the garden. And a lot of this comes down to the varieties that we're wanting to grow and what plants we want to try. So I'll sit down with my family, and I'll have highlighted or circled stuff in like the whole seed catalogue that I get from Baker Creek each year. Yes, I'm a big fan of heirloom seeds. But, I'll sit down and I'll show them, and I'll say, hey, these are things that, I think we would like to grow. Which one do we want to grow? And we basically take a vote on it. And the one that wins is the one that we try. So it's all about bringing that community together. Now, once we've got our garden space mapped out and we know what our seeds are that we're going to be growing, the next thing to kind of think about is plant spacing, okay? So seed packets, great source of information, okay? They give you most of the plant spacings between each plant, okay? And that's how far apart the center of each plant needs to be for optimum growing conditions, okay? You can use things like a seed spacing calculator that's going to figure out how many to plant in your garden space. So for example, my garden beds are 5 foot by 3 foot, okay? And if I use a seed spacing calculator, and I can link that up in the description. Okay, but let's pretend that we wanted to plant the entire bed with Romanesco broccoli, okay? And that's going to need a spacing of 18 to 24 inches. So you basically put in your garden bed length and width, okay? So that'll be 5 by 3. And then the plant spacing, which will be 18 inches on the smaller side. And then, the calculator will just kind of churn out how many plants that you can do there. So if I always choose the smaller spacing, and I can do that because I live in a drier climate, I can get more plants in, okay? So I could be putting a greater number of plants in that same space. Now, if I live somewhere where it was hot and humid, like my family back in Texas, then I'm going to need the larger plant spacing because I need to make sure that we've got plenty of airflow through there. So in our broccoli example, okay, I could be planting 7 broccoli plants if I was using the 18 inches distancing between plants, and I was planting in kind of blocks, so in a kind of square pattern. Okay, now if I off center those and I plant on a zigzag or a diagonal, which is what I use, then I can squeeze in 8 plants using that 18 inches spacing. Now, obviously, if you've got that humid climate, you want to have more space between your plants so you've got a bigger airflow. But that's a really easy hack, is to use a diagonal planting pattern or a triangular planting pattern, because you're going to be able to put more in within the space. So I'm going to link up to the tool that I've used previously to help do the spacing calculations and kind of give you a visual on what that looks like. So definitely check that out. Now, if you're looking at feeding or planting to feed your family, then there's a lot of factors that you need to think about, okay? And it depends on the number of people that you have in your household, their eating habits, and if you're trying to figure out how many plants do you need to feed your family. Every family is going to be different, okay? One family might need to grow, 1,000 bulbs of garlic, whilst another family has a real love of Brussels sprouts, okay? That might be totally different from your family, okay? So there's a lot of information in there, but if you're really wanting to feed your family for the whole year, then you are going to need to really plan out your garden and plan out your crop timings very carefully, because you're going to probably be needing at least 4,000 square feet of growing space per person to accommodate growing all of that fruit and vegetables, okay? And obviously a family of 4 is going to need far less than a family of 6, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not to say that you can't maximize the space that you have by growing vertically, so using varieties that vine and grow up, things like companion planting, successional sowing. And successional sowing is basically providing a continuous supply of different vegetables over a long period of time. So cabbages or leeks tend to follow potatoes or early peas in the same garden bed. But successional sowing is also where you would be sowing every 2 to 3 weeks, let's say lettuce or carrots or something, and then you will be able to be constantly harvesting that after the number of days to maturity, and then the next sort of 3 weeks passes, and then your next batch becomes ready for harvest. Another trick that people use to maximize is called intercropping, and that's where you're using all of the space available by growing rows of quick maturing crops between those which take longer to grow. So, for example, sowing radishes with parsnips. Parsnips take a long time to germinate. Radishes are typically done within 30 days, if not less. Lettuce between rows of peas is another common example, or marrows, aka overgrown zucchini, between sprouts. Well, Brussels sprouts is a common one that we used in England. Same with spring onions with lettuces, or radishes between rows of cabbages. Okay, it's really like making full use of that soil. Another one is catch cropping, which is where you grow a quick maturing crop wherever land falls vacant for a short period. So, for example, lettuce can be grown on the ridge of the soil from a trench dug for celery, for example, because if you're growing celery, you're going to be drawing up that soil up and over the stalks to kind of blanch them. Same could be said for potatoes. The lettuce is going to mature way before the soil's needed for earthing up the celery, or even the potatoes. So it's really thinking about the space and how you grow and what you can do to grow more in that space. Now, of course, using square foot gardening, triangular sowing patterns, you can grow plants a lot more intensively, and that's got a lot of benefits like shading the soil, reduces weeds, of course more plants, but they can also be more work, okay, because you've got to be continually sowing, putting the space to use for a new crop from your garden bed. So if you're a new gardener, that might be a little bit too much for you. What you really want to be concentrating on is getting the basics down and growing some plants, right? You can also leverage varieties that mature at different times, so things like early, mid-season and late varieties of potatoes or even corn, and that's going to produce more in the space that you have available. Now, the amount that you're going to plant depends on the plant as well. So in my small garden bed, if I'm growing vining plants and just letting them go over the whole bed, then I probably can't get more than one vining squash in there. However, because I have trellising, I'm able to trellis the majority of things like cucumbers, melons, squashes, pole beans, stuff like that are going to make, like normally they would take up a lot of space in the garden, but because I'm growing them up and over a trellis, that frees up a lot more space in that garden bed to grow other things in there. Maybe it's some lettuces, maybe it's sweet potatoes, maybe it's carrots or whatever. So that's some of the tricks that I use to maximize what's growing in the actual garden bed. And you can look to do some of those things too. And I mentioned earlier that having plants to provide compost and help grow my compost pile is what's helping drive some of that fertility, and being able to make my garden a lot more sustainable. I have herbs and things that I grow in separate areas, so I don't grow them in with the other plants like the vegetable gardens and stuff. They're in a different box or a different container there, so they're not taking up space. So things like comfrey likes to spread and gets kind of all over, and I don't necessarily want that all in the garden bed, so I grow that in and out of the way area. I still go to it often and chop things down and bring them in and do all that with the garden, but I don't interplant things that are perennial, typically in the garden with stuff that I'm going to be changing each year. There's a couple of exceptions. I've got a couple of beds where I've got strawberries and blackberries together, for example, and I've got some where they grow Jerusalem artichokes, and there's another bed where I have salsify and scorzonera growing, and they've kind of established themselves there now. But for the most part, I keep those things separate and away from the vegetable garden, just so I can, really maximize the growing space and not lose too much as those perennials become established. And you can do some of those same things too. So if you're wanting some of these, herbs and plants that, really like to get established, plan those out into where you're going to be putting them in the ground if that's what you're wanting to do. But you could also grow them in pots and containers and put them out into the garden area too. That works just fine. And that actually has a lot of benefits too, because you can move them out of the way, and you can keep them from spreading too. Now, to seriously own growing a garden, you're going to need to put your plants and your seeds in the right position, okay? So you want things that are heat loving, that are over where you're going to have the maximum amount of sunlight. It's going to help ripen the fruit. Very important if you are in a short growing season area. So as a rule of thumb, okay, things that are north facing is going to be great for things that like shaded, cooler and moist temperatures. Things that are going to be facing the west is where you get afternoon sun, so kind of heat loving things are going to be good there, because especially if it's by a building or something where you're going to get a lot of that radiant heat over the night. East early sun in the morning, shaded in the afternoon. So that's often a good spot for things that need a little bit of break from a lot of, the sun. And then south facing is obviously hot, sun-loving and drier if you live in the north, okay? Plants that you'd want to protect from scorching in the afternoon are things like cilantro. Like if cilantro gets too hot, it runs to seed very quickly. You might consider putting that on the east side of a tall plant, which is going to cast shade in the afternoon, or maybe put it on the east side of your property. Northern parts, maybe you could put rhubarb or salad leaves or things like that are prone to, bolting or running to seed. And herbs like sorrel, chives or parsley tend to do in those kind of north-facing areas. And crop rotation is really important for a self-sufficient garden, okay? And crop rotation is simply moving annual crops around the garden so that you don't grow the same thing in the same space, okay? The aim of crop rotation is to maintain a balance of the microorganisms and the nutrients in the soil. And if you're growing the same plant type in the same location, year after year, it's going to reduce your yields and it's going to introduce pests and diseases. And some of these pests and diseases linger in the soil for decades. Okay, not just years, decades. So it's really important to kind of move things about. And there's plants that are in different types of families. Okay, and there's typically 9 types of families. You have the nightshades, which include tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, tomatillos, potatoes, and ground cherries. You have legumes, which are peas, beans, peanuts, cowpeas or black-eyed peas, and green manures like hairy vetch, broad beans or fava beans, those things as well. Your brassicas are leafy vegetables like cabbage, kohlrabi, broccoli, mustard greens, turnips, kale, cauliflower and radish. You have the grass family, which is maize, sweet corn, popping corn, flint corn. Cucurbits are your squashes, so think winter squash, summer squash, melons, cucumbers, gourds, loofahs as well. Root vegetables or root families are things like carrots, parsnips, salsify, scorzonera, sweet potatoes sometimes included in that as well. Daisy family are things like lettuces, Jerusalem artichoke and sunflowers. The goosefoot family are beets, spinach and chard. And your alliums or your onion family are garlic, leeks and scallions. And really what you want to be doing with this is you want to rotate through your crop families on a schedule. So each year you're going to be growing something different in that space, okay? So you could start year 1 with the legumes, and then you move to the goosefoot family, and then the 3rd year you move to the allium family, and then the 4th year you would go to the cucurbit family, and the 5th year it would be the daisy family, the 6th year it would be the brassica family, and the 7th year it would be the root family, and the 8th year maybe you grow the nightshades. And then year 9 would be the grass family. Now there's lots of different crop rotations and there's lots of different ways that you can rotate your crops, okay? There's a lot more simple ones where, I don't know, let's say you've got a 4-year rotation plan. So the first year you're going to grow potatoes in one area, and the 2nd year you're going to grow peas, and the 3rd year you're going to grow maybe leeks in there. Or cabbages or something, and then the 4th year you're going to grow your root veggies in there. So there's a simple ways to incorporate that. But if you're like me and you like to grow lots of different things together, then crop rotations can get a little bit complicated. So if you are into polyculture, or that's where you're growing things together, for example, let's say you're doing the Three Sisters planting, so you're growing corn, pole beans and squash together, there may be that same bed where you were growing that crop together. The following year, maybe you just plant carrots and onions together in that bed, okay? You're not planting any of those similar families together. You want to be providing a break because it's going to reduce that buildup of pests and diseases. And also, you're going to be adding compost each year to your garden beds, so that's going to help replenish those nutrients that are lost. But that's why it's important to have a plan, and that's why having a self-sufficient garden plan is very important, because you're going to be keeping some record of what you were growing in those spaces, each year, so you can go back and see, well, last year I grew, corn in this bed, and well, I probably shouldn't grow corn in the same bed. Maybe I should grow something different in there instead. And, using this information on where to plant and the plant spacing, that's going to help you draft up your garden plan of where your plants are going to go, how many to plant in that area. And honestly, winter's a good time to start planning your garden. And I know I'm talking about this in the middle of summer. We've just gone past, the beginning of July. And, this is going to be going out in early July. And you're probably thinking that I'm totally crazy by talking about some of these things now, but now's a really good time to be taking photos, looking at what's growing well, so you can start to think about some of these things and start bringing elements of this into your plan for next year. And honestly, every time I plan my garden, I plan it 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 times before I settle on, this is the plan for the garden, this is what's going to grow, and this is how I'm going to grow it. And, one of the great things about planning your garden is that you've got a better sense of what's going to be becoming mature at what times, and what space is going to become available. And some of the spacings that are going to becoming available are going to mean that you can plant more things in those spaces. So maybe you can put an extra low of lettuce in there, or maybe you're going to grow another round of peas in early fall or something. But all of these things that you're growing are all producing, materials that you're going to be adding to your compost pile. They're going to be feeding you, they're going to be feeding your family, as well as your garden. And of course, any scraps that you have from the kitchen, if you're putting them all in the compost pile too, that compost is going to be growing, it's going to be getting better. And every time you spread that compost down on the ground, it's going to help your garden get even better each year. And days to maturity are going to be very helpful when it comes to planning your garden, and most seed packets have got that information on there. And getting an understanding of, if I plant at this date and then roughly this many days afterwards I should be seeing some harvesting, I would buffer it by a good 3 weeks or so, because sometimes we have weird weather, sometimes plants take a little bit longer to grow, but it really helps you see how quickly things are going to grow and how you can utilize that space better. So if I'm growing Determinate Tomatoes, so these are ones that become ripe all at the same time, after they've ripened and I've harvested them, I don't want to be leaving that tomato plant in there. It's not going to keep growing like an indeterminate variety. So I'm just going to be ripping those plants out, sticking them in the compost heap, and guess what? Something else is getting planted in that space. A lot of people use the time to add a bit more fertilizer in there, maybe add some compost and stuff. And of course, fertilizers don't necessarily mean, chemical fertilizers, but they'll be adding some nutrients back in there and maybe putting out plants for their fall garden. So, things like cabbages or leeks that like very nutritious soil, it's a good time to be thinking, what can I be planting in this space after these summer crops are done? And we want to be really making space for some of these. So, if I wanted to be harvesting carrots, for example, before the frost, I'm going to need to be planting carrots around August to make sure that they are big enough for harvesting before the frost comes or is predicted to come in my area. So I hope this episode was kind of helpful for you. And, a lot of gardeners and homesteaders use spreadsheet systems or diaries, or even a calendar where they write in the seeds that they're starting and when they're starting, or plants that they're going to transplant, and likely harvest dates. Okay, they're a very crucial tool for them to use, and this is how farmers are successful, right? They've got a plan. Okay, they know, if I'm sowing it this time, if the weather's good and things are all aligning, then I should be harvesting around this date. And a big part of gardening is experimenting and trial and error. When things fail and go wrong, there's a lesson to be learned from it. Okay, and you will get better each year that you grow, and you will learn to read the land and read your plants. And honestly, my final thought before I sign off for this episode is really that you got this. For real, you got this, and appreciate the wins and the fails when it comes to gardening, right? Mother Nature's always going to be a challenge for your garden, and experience is going to help you move with the flow. And there's lots of resources that are out there, and lots of help that's out there too. So until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I'll talk to you next week.